The GTA saga is an amazing one, full of realistic details. You commit robberies, you're usually this huge criminal inside any GTA game, building your story and your life right in the middle of all the crazy stuff the characters go through. And in all of that, if you get arrested, you just respawn at the police station and show up again to keep going like nothing ever happened. At most, you pay a pretty cheap bail and have your weapons or ammo confiscated. But what if the police system in GTA 5 was actually real, and our main characters were properly judged for the crimes they committed? Well, my friends, in today's video, I'm bringing you something different, and it was a hell of a lot of work, I'll tell you that up front, showing what Franklin's final sentence would be if he were tried for all the crimes he committed during GTA 5's story. And hey, if you guys like this video, I'll bring one for Michael and Trevor too. So, I'm going to bring you a list based on California laws here in the United States to try to get as accurate as possible with this calculation and see how this whole thing would turn out. So with that said, if you're into the channel, go ahead and drop a like and subscribe, and let's get started. And since we're only talking about Franklin, alright, we'll start with the mission Franklin and Lamar. There won't be any involvement from the prologue since that one only has Trevor and Michael. And an important point to keep in mind is, in this video, I'm going to assume that in free roam, you didn't run anyone over in the street or randomly kill NPCs. Okay? Only stuff that was basically mandatory during the missions, things you had to do instinctively. And usually when it comes to the heist approaches, I'll consider the ones that give the least jail time and fines for the character. In the mission Franklin and Lamar, it starts with an illegal vehicle repossession. Franklin and Lamar take cars from customers without any court order or legal recovery process. In practice, this in California would be treated as vehicle theft or unlawful taking of a vehicle. This could lead to up to 3 years in state prison and a fine of up to $10,000. Next, Franklin races Lamar with those 2 stolen cars through the streets of Los Santos. He would then face charges for participating in an illegal street race, which carries 90 days in jail and a fine of up to $1,000, plus reckless driving, which would add another 90 days in jail and another $1,000 fine, along with a license suspension for up to 6 months and possible community service. After that, the police set up an ambush for them since they're going to demand explanations after that illegal street race, and they flee from the police, which leads to a charge of fleeing the police with reckless driving, carrying up to 3 years of state prison time and fines of up to $10,000 with possible license suspension and vehicle impoundment. And to wrap it up, this mission isn't over yet. There's still participation in a legal resale scheme, because after the escape, Franklin drops off the car at Simeon's dealership, which clearly runs a scheme with cars obtained illegally. In this case, Franklin is also involved in a stolen goods resale operation, receiving charges for receiving and selling stolen property with up to 3 years in prison and fines up to $10,000. In the mission Repossession, Franklin and Lamar head out to do another job for Simeon, which is to recover a motorcycle in Vagos-controlled territory. The problem here is that this situation quickly escalates into something more serious, and even before things get started, Franklin already gets a gun from Lamar in public, without any kind of license. In California, that would be carrying a loaded firearm in public without authorization. It's a crime of illegal possession of a loaded firearm, punishable by up to 3 years in prison and fines up to $10,000, with the additional consequence of permanently losing the right to own firearms and having the weapons confiscated. That part's pretty obvious. But beyond that, an armed confrontation with the rival gang kicks off, and even if it's in self-defense, it's still considered second-degree murder in gang fights and all that, with possible sentences per victim ranging from 15 years to life in prison. Since there are multiple victims, the sentences can be added up or served consecutively, depending on what the judge decides. In this same mission, Franklin shoots a trail of gasoline on the ground, causing a big explosion that destroys the vehicle. In California, this would be classified as arson, causing property damage, with a possible sentence of up to 9 years in prison and a fine of up to $50,000. Additionally, Franklin could be required to pay compensation for the damages caused. After that, Franklin chases the owner of the green bike, the one we were sent to recover, kills him, and ends up keeping the vehicle in the end. This would be treated as homicide during the commission of a crime, which carries a possible life sentence plus the penalty for vehicle theft, which is 3 years in prison and a fine of up to $10,000. In the mission Complications, Franklin goes to Michael's house to do another job for Simeon. This time he shows up and assaults the gardener. This physical assault causing injury can lead to up to 1 year in prison and a $2,000 fine, plus medical expenses for the victim and possible community service. So far, pretty chill, right? A bit later, Franklin breaks into Michael's house without permission, which could result in up to 6 months in jail and a fine of up to $1,000 for trespassing on private property. After that, Franklin, inside the garage, takes Jimmy's car without any permission. That would also count as vehicle theft, adding another 3 years of state prison and a fine of $10,000. And finally, when Michael points a gun at his head and tells him to smash through the glass at the dealership, Franklin is charged with criminal destruction of commercial property. Some people might say Franklin was forced to do it, and that's true. But in the end, as soon as he breaks into the dealership, Michael pays him, and since Franklin accepts the money, that means he's knowingly participating in the crime, so he would be judged with the penalties I just mentioned, plus additional consequences like civil compensation for the damages caused and paying for the reconstruction of the facade and the damaged vehicles. Moving on to the mission Father-Son, Michael calls Franklin to help recover his boat. But this whole thing is messed up, man, because participating in a dangerous chase on public roads is also a crime since there's a charge for reckless driving on public roads. Even though Franklin isn't the driver, he actively takes part in the chase, basically encouraging it to continue. He could get up to 90 days in jail, which is not much, and a fine of up to $1,000, with possible suspension of his driver's license. Later on, he makes a jump from a moving vehicle when he jumps onto the truck trying to recover another boat. That could lead to a charge for putting others at risk, which could mean up to a year in prison and a $1,000 fine. On the boat, he physically attacks other people. He doesn't shoot directly, but still, that would be considered a crime because of the physical assault, which could mean up to 6 months in jail and a $1,000 fine. Moving on to the mission Marriage Counseling, Michael finds out Amanda is having an affair with the tennis instructor, and Franklin helps him chase down the tennis coach to demand some answers. Even though Franklin isn't the one who started this, he ends up taking an active part in the chase, and that would also count as reckless driving on a public road because they're driving like maniacs, with a possible sentence of 90 days and up to $1,000 in fines. But things get a bit more serious later on when Franklin helps Michael with the huge balcony at Marty Madrazo's house, facing charges of aggravated vandalism with high-value damages, with a possible sentence of up to 3 years in prison and fines up to $10,000 plus full civil compensation for the property damage and payment for the house's reconstruction. After that, the Mexican cartel's goons come after Michael and Franklin, and a shootout starts right in the middle of the street. Charged with shooting with a firearm with a possible sentence of up to 4 years in state prison, fines up to $10,000, gun ownership prohibition, and an aggravating factor for using weapons in a residential area. Arriving at the mission shop, Franklin and Lamar chase Dee through the streets, trying to catch him. But first, he shows up to threaten Dee, and then the chase begins. The charges here would be criminal threat and pursuit, which could mean up to 3 years in prison and a fine of up to $10,000, plus a restraining order and possibly community service. Later on, Franklin lets his dog, Chop, loose to attack Dee and stop him from escaping. In this case, he'd face charges of assault using an animal as a weapon, which carries up to 4 years in prison and a $10,000 fine, plus possible seizure of the animal. After capturing Dee, Franklin helps Lamar put him in the van against his will. And I think this one goes without saying, it's kidnapping. That could mean up to 8 years in state prison and a fine of up to $10,000, followed by extortion when Lamar calls the rival gang demanding $40,000 for Dee's release. That adds another 4 years in prison and another fine of up to $10,000. Remember that at the end of this mission, Franklin realizes things are getting way out of hand and decides to let Dee go, but that doesn't erase the kidnapping charge. It might be considered a mitigating factor by the judge and all, but I highly doubt anything like that would actually happen. Still talking about gang trouble, Franklin moves on to another mission called The Long Stretch. There he goes to a possible drug or weapons deal where he gets ambushed by Dee. Even if the deal doesn't go through, Franklin is actively trying to buy either narcotics or weapons. In this case, he would face charges of attempted purchase or conspiracy to acquire controlled substances or weapons. That could mean up to 3 years in prison and a fine of up to $10,000. After that, he has a shootout with gang members. Even if he's just trying to survive, firing at others in a gunfight would be treated as second-degree murder. That could carry a possible sentence per victim of 15 years to life in prison. It would depend on the judge and a bit of the context. The defense could claim self-defense, but since Franklin went armed to a criminal meetup, I think it'd be really hard for him to argue that successfully in court. When they leave the warehouse, they have to destroy at least one police helicopter, otherwise the mission won't continue. And attacking a police aircraft is a very serious crime. He would face charges for destroying a public safety aircraft with a possible sentence of up to 20 years in federal prison. If any officer on board dies, the charge could be treated as homicide of a law enforcement officer, which would lead to life imprisonment. After that, there's another police chase by car, which could result in up to 3 years in prison, a fine of up to $10,000, license suspension, and confiscation of the vehicle used. Now moving on to a more detailed scenario, the jewelry store heist. In the jewelry heist, there are two approaches. One is the smart way and the other is the loud way. For the final total I'll calculate later, I'll always consider the approach that results in the least prison time or fines, alright? In both approaches, Franklin is involved in a conspiracy to commit robbery, so just the fact that he's part of the plan could already land him up to 3 years in prison. After that, he breaks into private property where he's going to release sleeping gas into the jewelry store's ventilation system. Then he'd face charges of trespassing with criminal intent, which carries 3 years in prison and a fine of up to $10,000. Since he releases the gas through the store's ventilation to knock out employees and customers, he would face another charge, illegal administration of a disabling substance, which carries up to 4 years in prison and a fine of up to $10,000. And the high-value robbery he was involved in, even as the getaway driver, he was a key part of the crime, would add up to 5 years in prison and another fine of up to $10,000 for that part. Finishing off with the police chase, which would add another 3 years in prison and a fine of up to $10,000. Actually, it would end with money laundering, because after the robbery, the money needs to be cleaned to enter the legal economy. Franklin agrees to receive his share, knowing the money's criminal origin since he took part in the robbery, so he would face one more charge, conspiracy to launder money, which could mean another 5 years in prison and a fine of up to $250,000 depending on the amount involved. In the loud approach, Franklin goes straight into the jewelry store along with Michael to carry out the robbery. This makes the crime much more serious because he invades armed, holds employees and customers at gunpoint, and even without firing or killing anyone, pointing a gun during a robbery already counts as armed robbery, which would bring 9 years in prison and a fine of up to $10,000. After that, there's the threat and intimidation of civilians, which would be the charge of unlawful imprisonment, with another 3 years in prison and a fine of up to $10,000. High-value robbery, since the group steals millions of dollars in jewelry from the store, which would add 5 more years of prison time. And finally, fleeing the police plus money laundering. The escape brings 3 years in prison and a fine of up to $10,000, and money laundering carries a fine up to $250,000 depending on the amount involved and up to 5 years in prison. After that, things get more federal, you know? And then we get into that whole mess involving the IAA, because Michael is being pressured by corrupt agents from the EFIB to take part in operations against the rival agency, which is the IAA. And Franklin decides to help Michael in this situation and takes part in some missions providing support, and even like more actively than just support. In this first mission, the goal is to eliminate agents and enable Mr. K's escape along with Trevor and Michael. This puts Franklin directly in conflict with armed federal agents, which drastically raises the severity of the crimes, starting with the murder of a federal agent, since Franklin with a sniper shoots multiple federal agents so that Michael can get away with Mr. K. That alone would mean per victim a possible life sentence. Besides that, he has the illegal use of a sniper rifle in a criminal operation that would lead to a federal violent crime firearms charge, which would add at least 10 extra years in prison, mandatory consecutive to the main sentence. Franklin also destroys helicopters during this mission, and taking down an aircraft with people on board is a serious federal crime that can carry a life sentence, and putting civilians at risk in an urban area, since the shootout happens right in the urban area of Los Santos with sniper shots and helicopters crashing and all that. This could be treated as putting civilians at extreme risk with firearms, carrying up to 10 years in prison and a fine of up to $250,000. Man, this is a bombshell, huh? Next, we move on to the mission Blitz Play, which involves a conspiracy for armed robbery. From the start, Franklin is kind of involved in everything, and just the conspiracy charge alone carries 3 years in prison. Then there's vehicle theft used in the crime. They have to steal some vehicles and all. That adds another 3 years and a fine of up to $10,000. The armored truck attack, since Franklin drives the tow truck straight into the armored truck, blocking the vehicle. Attacking an armored transport vehicle with intent to steal counts as aggravated robbery, leading to an aggravated armored transport robbery charge with a sentence of up to 9 years in prison. After the armored truck is taken down, Franklin uses explosives to open it, which adds 10 more years and a fine of up to $10,000 for illegal use of explosives during the robbery. Inside the armored truck are bearer financial instruments, which are stolen to be delivered to Devin Weston, resulting in an additional charge of high-value financial asset theft, with a possible sentence of 5 years in prison and a fine of up to $10,000. On top of that, there's the killing of several police officers that happens during this mission. That would lead to charges of homicide of law enforcement officers, with a possible sentence per victim ranging from 25 years up to life in prison. Adding to that, the destruction of police vehicles would bring another 10 years in prison and a fine of up to $250,000 for destruction of government property. At the end of this mission, there's evidence destruction when Franklin helps to destroy the garbage truck used in the ambush to eliminate proof of the crime. That would lead to charges of obstruction of justice and destruction of evidence, adding another 5 years in prison and a $10,000 fine. And then the police chase at the end, which adds 3 years in prison and a $10,000 fine. After that comes the mission Hood Safari, where Franklin, Lamar, and Trevor head to Grove Street to make a drug deal with the Ballast. Franklin acts as the driver and backup during the negotiation, but the deal quickly turns out to be a setup thanks to Trevor's intelligence, and it escalates into an all-out shootout. Since Franklin is involved in the deal involving an alleged package of cocaine, even though the drug ends up being fake, the initial intent still counts as attempted trafficking of a controlled substance or drug trafficking. This leads to a charge of conspiracy to traffic drugs, carrying penalties of up to 5 years in prison and fines up to $10,000. After that, there's the homicide during the gang fight, with possible penalties ranging from 15 years to life imprisonment for second-degree murder charges. Next up, there are the police officer murders. That leads to the charge of killing a law enforcement officer with a possible sentence per victim of 25 years to life in prison. Then there's the armed robbery when Franklin steals the jet skis from the MC Clip filming set. That would bring an armed robbery charge with up to 9 years in prison and a fine of up to $10,000. After the jet ski robbery, Franklin escapes through the city's canals until he reaches the ocean. That would only count as fleeing from the police with up to 3 years in prison and a fine of up to $10,000. Now we're getting into a heavy one, huh? This Merryweather heist is intense. Anyway, Trevor puts together an extremely risky job that's basically about stealing a supposed super weapon being transported by the private military company Merryweather. Franklin isn't the mastermind behind the plan, but he's involved from the prep all the way through the execution, which makes him legally part of the criminal conspiracy. Depending on the approach chosen, the way he participates changes. In the first approach, there's an attack on the cargo ship, where Michael boards the ship and Trevor comes in with the submarine, while Franklin acts as a sniper providing support from the port. In this case, he kills several soldiers to steal military technology. This leads to the charge of conspiracy to commit military technology theft, with up to 10 years of federal prison and a fine of up to $250,000. During the ship attack, Franklin is using a rifle to kill Merryweather soldiers, and since it's a private company, the security guards act as hired armed forces, which makes the crime a bit more serious than against a regular civilian, adding the charge of armed security homicide. That carries a possible sentence of 15 years to life in prison per victim. After that, there's the destruction of an aircraft, where destroying a helicopter is mandatory, which could add 20 more years in prison, possibly life if anyone inside the helicopter dies. There's also the crime of using a firearm during a violent federal crime, since he's using the sniper rifle, adding a minimum of 10 extra years in prison. Now in the second mode, which is the high sea mode, Trevor dives down to the super weapon using the submarine to recover it, while Franklin basically keeps supporting the plan. Here he faces the same charge of conspiracy to steal military equipment, which carries up to 10 years of federal prison and a fine of up to $250,000. Participation in an illegal armed operation, which could add up to 5 years in prison. And there's one I actually forgot to mention earlier, right? I even had it written down here. The charge would be conspiracy to traffic military technology. Since transporting or selling strategic military tech to another country can be treated as that charge, they'd be looking at 20 years of federal prison and a fine of up to $1 million for that. This applies to both heist scenarios. I forgot to mention it in the first one. At the end of the mission, Lester finds out the super weapon is super dangerous and asks the group to return the weapon to the sea. That wouldn't erase the crime if they got charged. It could at most be a sentence mitigating factor, but I seriously doubt it. After that, Franklin starts doing some sort of exclusive jobs for Devin Weston. This time, Franklin takes on a different role. He's the one coordinating the theft of several extremely rare luxury cars. Meanwhile, Trevor and Michael act more like the enforcers and helpers, while Franklin is the boss in charge there. Just for organizing the vehicle thefts, he'd already faced a charge of conspiracy to steal vehicles, which could mean up to 3 years in prison and a fine of up to $10,000. After that, there's the receiving of the stolen vehicles, since he took them to another property. With the charge of receiving stolen stolen property, that would add another 3 years in prison and a possible fine of up to $10,000. He also takes part in an illegal street race with the two rich guys, which would bring 90 days in jail and a $1,000 fine, along with reckless driving on a public road, which would add another 90 days in jail and another $1,000 fine. After Michael and Trevor manage to grab the vehicles, they have another street race, this time Franklin, Michael, and Trevor. That would again mean 90 days in jail and $1,000 for the race, plus another 90 days and $1,000 for reckless driving on a public road. After that, Franklin has another mission to do for Devin Weston. This time it's to recover another rare car. This one belongs to Chad Mulligan. In this mission, Franklin first takes part in a chase on public roads, so it's just reckless driving since he's not racing. That would mean 90 days in jail and a $1,000 fine. But there are two scenarios in this mission. In the first scenario, when Franklin catches up to Chad Mulligan in the parking lot, he can knock out the driver. Knocking out the driver counts as physical assault, which could get him up to a year in prison and a fine of up to $2,000. Then he would steal the vehicle, which adds another 3 years in prison and up to a $10,000 fine. Or he could choose not to knock out the driver. In that case, he wouldn't face assault charges or a fine, but he would still start with the vehicle theft charge, which carries 3 years in prison and up to a $10,000 fine. However, in this scenario, where he doesn't take down Chad Mulligan, Chad calls the cops. Then you have to run from the police, which adds another 3 years in prison and another $10,000 fine. So basically, the best move here is to just beat the guy up. That way, at least you're only looking at the 1-year assault charge. After that, I think we have the biggest fine in the game. That's in the Mission Hotel Assassination. Because it's not a robbery, it's a hit job. The target is a CEO of a major pharmaceutical company, and Lester's final plan involves manipulating the stock market with his death. Franklin is the one carrying out the long-range attack using a sniper rifle. The charge he'd face at first would be contract murder, which carries 25 years up to life in prison. Depending on the circumstances, the prosecutor might try to charge it as first-degree murder, which also means life without parole. On top of that, there's the use of a sniper rifle in a violent crime, which adds the charge of using a firearm during a violent felony, adding at least 10 more years on top of the main sentence. And the biggest of all, I think it's the highest fine of all Franklin's crimes here. Market manipulation. That means being involved in a scheme like this for fraud and market manipulation, which carries a charge of conspiracy to commit financial fraud, with a possible sentence of up to 20 years in federal prison and a fine of up to $5 million. After that, Franklin goes for the robbery of Devin Weston's fourth car. This time it's inside the Richard Majestic studio. The vehicle is being used on the film set inside the movie studio, and to pull off the theft, Franklin needs to sneak into the studio and take on the identity of an actor. In this case, I'll assume Franklin didn't kill anyone, he just ran away, alright? That would lead to the first charge of trespassing with criminal intent, which carries up to 1 year in prison and a $1,000 fine. Assault to assume the identity when he knocks out the actor who was in the scene and takes his clothes, which would mean up to 1 year in prison and a $2,000 fine. At least it's a small amount, and he would also have to cover the victim's medical expenses. Identity theft, which would count as the charge of ideological falsehood or fraudulent impersonation, that's when he pretends to be the actor. That would add another year in prison and a fine of up to $10,000. During the scene shoot, Franklin takes control of the car being used in filming and speeds off from the studio. That would lead to a vehicle theft charge with 3 years in prison and up to $10,000 in fines. Reckless driving, which is when he drives like a maniac, would be 90 days in jail and a $1,000 fine. Like I said, here we'll assume Franklin freed the actress, stopped the car, and let her get out, which wouldn't add any extra charges to this mission. After that, now we move on to the Paleto Bay heist, where after several smaller jobs, Michael, Trevor, and Franklin pull off a major robbery in the town of Paleto Bay. Franklin isn't involved in planning the heist, but he agrees to help by acting as the getaway driver, waiting on a boat in Alamo Sea to pick up the crew after the robbery. Even though he's not inside the bank, the law still considers Franklin part of the criminal conspiracy. That means he'd face charges for conspiracy to commit bank robbery, which could mean up to 20 years in federal prison and a fine of up to $250,000. After that, there's the heavy equipment theft, since he steals a backhoe to clear the way for his buddies when things go south. That carries up to 3 years in prison and a fine of up to $10,000. There's also the armed rescue during the military standoff. That would carry up to 10 years in prison when he saves his friends. And attacking military personnel, which happens when he goes down to that chicken factory. There's an intense shootout against the soldiers sent to stop the heist. In the United States, attacking members of the armed forces during an operation can be treated as attempted murder of military personnel. So he would face charges of attempted murder against military members with up to 20 years in prison. Followed by violent crime, since it would be fleeing after a violent crime, adding another 5 years. And receiving stolen money, since he receives $400,000 directly from the robbery, which would add 5 more years in prison and a fine up to $250,000. If you think it's bad, it doesn't stop there, alright? There's the Humane Labs break-in, where they have to steal a highly dangerous toxin and stop it from being used in a possible terrorist attack. Franklin doesn't take part directly in the lab break-in. His role in the operation is simpler: to recover a truck and wait for Michael, Trevor, and Dave Norton at Sandy Shores Airport for the extraction. Even so, the law still considers Franklin an active part of the operation. He'd face charges of conspiracy to steal a dangerous chemical agent. He could get up to 20 years in federal prison and a fine of up to $1 million. Then, for his involvement in the illegal transport of a dangerous chemical agent, he'd get an additional 15 years in federal prison and a fine of up to $250,000. He'd also be charged with putting the public at extreme risk, since they were carrying a toxin that could accidentally be released, which carries another 10 years in prison. And since he helps everyone involved escape, he'd also face federal obstruction of justice charges. That would add 5 more years in prison and a fine of up to $250,000. After that, he heads back to Los Santos to finish off the stolen cars for Devin Weston. Lamar has already managed to steal the 5th car. Now the plan is for Franklin to help him by loading everything onto a car carrier truck and all that. So, Franklin drives one of the stolen cars to escort the transport along with Trevor and Lamar. And halfway through, the cops catch wind of the operation and start the chase. For transporting stolen vehicles, he'd face charges of transporting and possessing stolen property, which could mean up to 3 years in prison and a $10,000 fine. Then there's the armed attack on the cops, which happens a bit further along when Franklin uses a machine gun mounted in the car to shoot at the police cruisers, and also those spike strips dropped on the road. That would be a very serious crime, basically attempted homicide of a law enforcement officer with up to 20 years in prison. There's also the use of automatic weapons in public, which would lead to charges of illegal use of an automatic weapon and violent crime, adding another 10 years in prison plus up to a $10,000 fine. There's also fleeing the police with dangerous driving, which could mean up to 3 years in prison and a $10,000 fine, and maybe some harsher penalties if you actually ended up killing a cop, like life imprisonment or something similar. After several hits and conflicts with different organizations and all that, Michael gets kidnapped by the Chinese triad over in Ludendorff. Franklin finds out something went down and asks Lester for help locating his friend. To find Michael, Franklin uses an app that taps into his signal without a court order. Intercepting or tracking private communications without a judicial warrant counts as electronic privacy invasion. With the charge of illegal access to communication data, that alone could land him 5 years in prison and up to $250,000 just for trying to help his buddy, man. Damn. After that, Franklin storms into the slaughterhouse used by Triad members, facing the charge of trespassing with criminal intent, which could add another 3 years and a $10,000 fine. Then there are the homicides during the shootout, since Franklin kills several Triad members, with possible sentences per victim ranging from 15 years to life for second-degree murder charges. He also faces charges for aiding escape after a violent crime, which could mean up to 5 years behind bars, since he helped an armed person get away after a violent confrontation. All of this definitely makes this mission way more serious. Getting closer to the end of all the charges stacking up against Franklin, we have the break-in at the FIB building. After rescuing Michael, the crew's gonna deal with a big problem by deleting files that could incriminate them and the corrupt agents inside FIB. In this case, there are 2 approaches. The first one is the firefighter approach. To pull off the plan, Franklin uses a stolen fire truck, which would lead to the first charge: stealing an emergency vehicle, carrying up to 5 years in prison and a fine of up to $10,000. Then there's impersonating a public official, since he's pretending to be a firefighter. That adds another 3 years in prison and up to $10,000 in fines. After that, there's the theft of the hard drive containing sensitive government data, which would add another 10 years of federal prison and a fine of up to $250,000 for stealing federal property and confidential information. When leaving the building, the FIB agents realize Franklin isn't a real firefighter, which kicks off a shootout between them, and Franklin ends up killing several federal agents. With the charge of killing a federal agent, he could face life imprisonment per victim. After all that, Franklin blows up the fire truck used in the operation to destroy the evidence, which adds charges of evidence destruction and obstruction of justice, carrying 5 years in prison and up to $10,000 in fines. When approaching the rooftop, it seems chill, but it's actually not that simple. Franklin is going to enter through the skylight of the FIB building to steal the data. In this case, the first charge would be breaking into a federal facility, which carries up to 10 years in prison and a $250,000 fine. During the mission, Michael or the crew will basically hack into the FIB servers to delete the files that incriminate the protagonist. This leads to a charge of conspiracy to illegally access government systems with up to 10 years in prison and a $250,000 fine. After that, there's a shootout with federal agents and cops, which could mean a possible life sentence per victim. Then there's the getaway after the violent federal crime, which adds up to another 5 years in prison in this case. After dealing with the problems at FIB, Franklin heads back into another gang fight. This time it's in the mission Lamar Down. Lamar ends up getting captured by the Ballas and taken to a sawmill in Paleto Bay. Tanisha tells Franklin and he calls Lester asking for help to track Lamar's cell phone. The problem here starts with the illegal phone tracking, which would be charged as unauthorized access to communication data, carrying up to 5 years in prison and a $250,000 fine. After that, Franklin plans the trip to the sawmill with Michael and Trevor, knowing the place is full of armed Ballas gang members. So it's a planned confrontation, which can be treated as conspiracy to commit violence. The charge here would be conspiracy to commit a violent crime, adding another 3 years in prison. Then there's the homicide during the gunfight, which would be second-degree murder. That could mean 15 years to life in prison, depending on how the judge interprets it. And there's aiding the escape after the shootout, since Franklin takes Lamar back to Los Santos after killing several Ballas members. And the last big heist here would be the Federal Reserve robbery. It's the biggest heist in all of GTA 5's history, making it clear that by the end here in this final job, actually in a few jobs, Franklin is no longer just a participant. He's basically an equal partner in the operation, involved in all the planning alongside Michael, Trevor, and Lester. And depending on the chosen strategy, the heist goes down in 2 different ways, which would carry different sentences if he got caught. In Method 1, which is the stealth approach, Franklin intercepts trucks carrying gold leaving the Union Depository. He takes part directly in the ambush and the getaway. The first charge he would face is conspiracy to rob high-value federal property, which could mean up to 20 years in federal prison and a fine of up to $250,000. Then there's the temporary kidnapping of the guards, who are subdued and kept under control, carrying a possible sentence of up to 8 years in prison. Later on, Franklin hacks the traffic system with a laptop using the compromise system to manipulate the city's traffic lights and help the others escape. Because of this, he would also face charges of illegal access to a government system, with up to 10 years in federal prison and a fine of up to $250,000. Next, the Merryweather mercenaries show up, and that's when the whole shootout begins. There would be homicide during a violent crime, adding another 15 years to life per victim. And lastly, the 2 big ones, the robbery of gold from the National Reserve, which would bring charges of large-scale federal theft with up to 25 years in prison and fines up to $1 million, and fleeing the police after a federal crime, which could add up to 5 years in prison. In the obvious approach, Franklin would face different charges since the operation is way more aggressive and involves direct combat with federal forces. Franklin breaches a federal facility when he operates the tunnel boring machine to open access to the bank vault. Because of that, he'd already faced the charge of unlawful entry into a federal facility, carrying up to 10 years in prison and a $250,000 fine. He could also be charged with illegal use of explosives in a federal crime, which would add another 10 years in prison. Then there's the robbery of the National Reserve, which could bring up to 25 years in prison and up to $1 million in fines. There's also the homicide of federal agents and the noose team, which is like the SWAT, with a possible penalty per victim ranging from 25 years to life in prison. Destruction of police vehicles and aircraft would bring charges for destruction of government property with up to 10 years in prison and fines up to $250,000. And finally, fleeing after a violent federal crime. After the shootout, Franklin escapes using the getaway vehicle that was prepared earlier, which would carry a charge of fleeing after a violent federal crime with up to 5 years in prison. After the biggest heist in the group's history, Franklin still had one last problem to deal with. Devin Weston and FIB agent Steve Haynes were trying to manipulate Franklin into killing Michael or Trevor. Franklin decides not to play their game and asks Lester for help to get out of the situation. Lester sets a trap for Merryweather soldiers and forces sent by corrupt agents. They end up clashing with Franklin, Michael, and Trevor. In the armed confrontation with mercenaries, Franklin takes part directly, killing several fighters from both the government and Merryweather's private army. This leads to a charge of homicide during an armed confrontation, with a possible sentence per victim ranging from 15 years to life imprisonment. After all that shooting, Franklin takes part in the assassination of Wei Sheng, where he himself kills the leader of the Chinese triad. This comes with a charge of qualified homicide and a possible sentence of 25 years to life in prison. To escape the place where you killed Wei Sheng, you have to kill a few more triad members, which results in a charge of second-degree homicide and a possible sentence per victim of 15 years to life imprisonment as well. After dealing with the triad problems, Franklin meets up with Trevor and Michael at the cliff. Devin is being held captive inside the car. Even though Franklin wasn't directly responsible for Devin Weston's initial kidnapping, he actively takes part in the final execution. This means he also faces kidnapping charges, carrying up to 8 years in prison, plus the murder of Devin Weston, since Franklin helps push the car with Devin locked in the trunk off the cliff. The vehicle explodes, killing Devin Weston. This kind of crime would be treated as premeditated homicide, with first-degree murder charges carrying from 25 years to life in prison. Now I want to know if you can somehow guess what Franklin's total fixed sentence would be, and how much in fines he'd have to pay. It's a crazy number. Keep in mind, I made a conservative estimate here, alright? If I had gone with the worst case scenario, like him killing a bunch of people on the streets, it would be way worse. Adding up everything I included, there might be a small mistake here or there, but the total fixed sentence came out to 547 years and 2 months in prison. Just to be clear, he wouldn't get any benefits for being a first-time offender since Franklin had been arrested before the GTA 5 story. So he'd be judged normally with possible fines up to $11,177,000. And just to be clear, that total of 547 years and 2 months is only the fixed sentence. It doesn't include converting multiple life sentences into years, because in several parts I made it clear there would be life sentences. And honestly, if you added all those up, it would go way beyond that. Even though it was a lot of work, I really enjoyed making this video, like thinking about what it would be like if these characters were actually put on trial at the end of the story. And if you want me to do a version with Michael or Trevor, which I believe will be way worse and longer, drop a comment so I know if you'd be interested. And if you liked this video, please hit that like button and subscribe right now so you don't forget, and to see more awesome videos like this. Click right here next to the yellow arrow to check out the final GTA 5 iceberg with solved mysteries and theories that will blow your mind. That said, big thanks to all of you, and see you in the next video. Peace.